The question is, which two popes divided Christianity forever? And in that meeting, the two men actually fired each other. The Pope excommunicated the Patriarch, and the Patriarch excommunicated the Pope. An attempt was made by Polycarp. He traveled to go to Rome to go and meet Eunis to see if they could try to reconcile their differences. Immediately, Charlemagne was canonized by the Pope. It actually initiated a new empire, and the new empire was now called the Holy Roman Empire. Today's question is another interesting question. We are looking at the division in Christianity. And the question is, which two popes divided Christianity forever? Many people have complained, particularly opposing religions, and other people are anti-Christianity. I've also wondered why there are so many divisions or so many denominations in Christianity. Now, most of the people actually have no knowledge of what happened way back. Now, Christianity was actually united for the first 1,000 years. Yes, 1,000 years, Christianity was unitary. Now, what you need to understand is that even if it was united, it was geographically divided. There was the Western and the Eastern Church. Basically, Christianity was divided geographically. The Western Church had its headquarters in Rome and had its leader called the Pope. The Eastern Church was from Turkey today, which was called Asia Minor, to Jerusalem, all the way to Jerusalem probably and beyond. And it had its leader who was called the Patriarch. Both words mean actually father. The other one is father in Latin for the Pope. The other one is father in Greek, which is Patriarch. Now, the headquarters for the Eastern Church was in Constantinople, which today is called Istanbul. So, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you have not, and also share this video, comment. If you have any question on any other theological issue, please don't forget to put it in the comment section, and we'll be able to respond to it, and if possible, even do a video on it. Before we go into how Christianity was divided forever, let's begin looking at factors that led to the division of Christianity. By the 11th century, Christianity was predominant. It has spread across many parts of the world. However, tensions begin to rise between the eastern part of the church and the western part of the church. Now, these tensions ranged from theological differences to cultural and linguistic divide, and finally to political tensions that existed between the two parts. The event that led to the division of Christianity forever is called the Great Schism, and it happened in 1054 AD in Istanbul, which was called Constantinople at that time. Before we look at these divisions, first let's look at the factors that led to these divisions, because the Christian church didn't just get divided overnight or because these two men met together. No, the issues and the differences had actually gone on for quite some time, for over 400, 600, perhaps even 700 years. As we shall see, there is an event that happened way back, even by AD 154, the differences had actually started to emerge by that time. Now, these divisions were not caused by one factor. There were several factors that caused the division between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. As the three major factors include theological differences, then cultural and linguistic divide, then the third one is political tensions that existed between the East and the West. Now, these differences started in the very early centuries of Christianity. By the 2nd century, divisions were evident. During the time of Eunis, who was based in Rome, there was a meeting that was actually held to try to reconcile these differences. And at that time, the differences were quite minor. And the major difference at that time was the difference in how they celebrated Easter. An attempt was made by Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna, also in today's Turkey. He traveled about AD 150 to AD 155 to go to Rome to go and meet Eunis to see if they could try to reconcile their differences. Now, the challenge was that they were celebrating Easter on different days. The church in the East celebrated Easter on 14th day of Nisan, which is during the Passover. But the church in the West celebrated Easter on a Sunday on the Lord's Day. Now, these two men attempted to reconcile their differences, but they could not come to an agreement. Eventually, they just agreed to disagree. Polycarp traveled back to Smyrna, where he had come from. And at that time, Polycarp was a well-known leader in the eastern part of the church. In fact, history or tradition says that Polycarp was actually a disciple of John. And because he had obtained apostolic traditions, he was very, very strong on adhering to those apostolic traditions. Let's start looking at the theological differences that divided the church. One of the major theological differences that the East had with the West, in addition to the date for celebrating Easter, is what is called the Filioque clause. Now, the word Filioque basically just means "and the Son." So what has that got to do with anything? Now, what happened was that in AD 381, a second church council after the Nicene Church Council of 325 AD that dealt with the Arian heresy, the council in Istanbul of AD 381 met to discuss the role of the Holy Spirit in the church. The first one focused on the divinity of Jesus Christ. The second one predominantly focused on the Holy Spirit. Of course, there were other aspects of Christology that were discussed at this conference also. Now, during this time, the church, both the East and the Western church, agreed to revise the Nicene Creed of 325, where they added the clause about the Holy Spirit, which says that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Now, remember, in the Nicene Creed of 325, the Holy Spirit was not very much elaborated. It was just, and we believe in the Holy Spirit. But as the heresy started emerging about who the Holy Spirit was, there was need to be able to sit and clarify and discuss the Holy Spirit. And therefore, the church agreed to add a clause which says that we believe in the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father. However, with the writing of Augustine of Hippo, who explained that the Holy Spirit also proceeded from the Son, therefore, the Western Church, without consultation with the Eastern Church, they added to the Nicene Creed that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. From that time, a quarrel ensued that lasted over 500 years, and it led to the division of what we've already mentioned as the Great Schism of 1054. The second theological difference between the East and the West was iconoclasm. Iconoclasm just means the use of images and icons to assist in Christian worship. Now, again, there was a difference here because The West said it was okay to use images, and they had their own justifications and examples as to why it was okay to use images. They said they were not worshipping, they were merely venerating those whose images depicted. The Eastern side, on the other hand, insisted that any use of images was actually idolatry, and they did not tolerate it. Now, in 787 AD, a church council, which was the last church council to be held between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, took place in 781 AD in Nicaea. This is the second church council taking place in Nicaea, and it focused on the use of icons, images in worship. Now, these icons included images and icons of Jesus Christ, Mary, the mother of Jesus, the saints, and the angels. So that was the issue. As I mentioned earlier, the Eastern Church was very emphatic. Although some agreement was established, later on the quarrel continued until AD 1054. Another theological difference that took place is what is called the Theotokos. Theotokos is a Greek word. Now, the East and the West again quarreled a lot over this. They differed a lot, and there was a conference that was held much earlier in 430 AD, and this conference took place in Ephesus. Now, Ephesus is very interesting because Ephesus was the center of goddess Diana. Now, goddess Diana was a goddess of fertility, and it was at this conference that this debate was held, and there was a discussion about the role of Mary in the church. And so there was a discussion that Mary be called Mary, the Mother of God. However, the Eastern Church insisted that Mary was just a God-bearer. She should be respected, but not to be given an honor that is equivalent to worship. The Eastern Church emphasized the role that Mary played, which was her humility and obedience to God to carry Jesus, but totally disagreed on an intercessor's role that the Western Church ascribed to Mary. In the early centuries of Christianity, especially the early part, Christianity had 5 bases, very strong bases. We had Rome in the west, we had Jerusalem in the east, then we had Antioch, and then Istanbul, which both belong to today's Turkey. And of course, the 5th one was in Africa, in North Africa, in Alexandria. Now, each of these cities had a bishop in charge of that particular city and the surrounding areas. Now, the quarrel ensued as to which one was more senior to the other. Of course, Rome, because it was the headquarters of the world then, of the Roman Empire, the Bishop of Rome insisted that he was the rightful leader of the church, and then they came up with what is called apostolic succession, that the Bishop of Rome, succeeded Peter. However, the other parts of the world, particularly the Bishop of Istanbul, the Bishop of Constantinople, also insisted that he was the leader. So this quarrel went on for some time. Now, the other thing that the difference is basically the tug of war was between the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople. The Bishop of Rome insisted that he was supreme on the matters of faith and governance of the church, having succeeded Peter. However, the Eastern Church rejected the authoritarian nature of the Bishop of Rome, which was more centralized and autocratic. They insisted on a decentralized administrative or ecclesiastical system. So this issue went on and on, but also the East more or less emphasized on the equality of bishops, that all bishops were actually on the same level. So those are the 3 major theological differences that existed between the East and the West. These included the the Filioque clause, the role of Mary in the church, which was called Theotokos, and the authority of the Pope, or papal authority. Let's look at another difference, another category of differences, and this is linguistic and the cultural divide. Now, linguistic and cultural divide, you have to understand that just as today, the East is very much different from the West. What is done in the East is done in the opposite in the West. I can give you some examples. For example, in the West, they write from left to right, whilst in the East, they write from right to left. And there are several other differences that exist between the East and the West. Now, what happened was that there was also the issue of language. The East used Greek, whilst the West used Latin. And whenever these people would meet, they would differ because one group would not understand the other. So the East insisted that they needed to speak Greek, which at that time, remember, with the Greek Empire having just collapsed and the Roman Empire coming in, Greek was more widespread than Latin. But Latin was a language of the guys in power, the ruling party of those days, which ruled from Rome. So they insisted that the church in the West insisted that the church in the East should be able to understand Latin, they should learn Latin so that they can be able to communicate. But as you know, the people in the East were also as stubborn as the people in the West. So they couldn't agree on which language to use. So there was a communication barrier between the two. And this actually even might have even contributed to the divide that existed between the two groups. Now imagine if you have other differences, you have theological differences, and at the same time you also have language barrier or language differences that actually compounds the problem that they were facing. The other difference that existed were political tensions that existed between the East and the West. Now, a brief background to this is that the Roman Empire in the West had collapsed 500 years before, precisely in 476 AD. The Roman Empire collapsed after being attacked by Germanic tribes, and many other tribes began to attack it. So the Roman Empire was weak for a very, very long time. And at that point, the church took over the role, and the Pope started playing not just a religious role, but also started playing a political role. Now before that, way back in 286 AD, there was an emperor called Diocletian. He had divided the Roman Empire into two parts, the western part and the eastern part. This was done just for administrative purposes. The challenge was that the empire had become too big and it was difficult to be managed. Therefore, there was need to be divided. Now, with the fall of the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire continued to exist for another 1,000 years after the western part of the empire had collapsed, until in 1456, somewhere about there, when the Ottoman Empire came and conquered what was called the Byzantine Empire, which was the eastern part of the Roman Empire. In 800 AD, there was one leader who came to power who tried to organize and hold Europe together, because at that time Europe was in total chaos. And this man who came to power was Charlemagne. There was a coronation of this emperor, so-called Emperor Charlemagne, in 800 AD, which is 300 years after the Western Roman Empire had collapsed, because before that, there wasn't anybody who was able to hold Europe together. It consisted of different bits and pieces, different tribes, and it was totally divided. As you can see on the map, what the Roman Empire was before AD 576, or how large the Roman Empire was before 476 AD, and after 476 AD. So now, at this point, immediately Charlemagne was canonized by the Pope. It actually initiated a new empire, and the new empire was now called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire means that, or why it was called the Holy Roman Empire, was because there was a fusion again, as it happened in 380 AD, when the church fused together with the state. At this point, the church had a direct role, was playing a direct role in political affairs. I remember, as I've mentioned, the church had filled in the vacuum of the collapsed Roman Empire. And that's why before, the Pope would not canonize the emperor, but now the Pope is playing a major role, and therefore the Pope was recognized. So we have one representing the church and the other one representing the political entity. And in fact, there was a point at which the Pope was actually even more powerful than the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, until 1500, when there was a Reformation. And again, in future, we may do another program on Reformation if many people would be interested in that program. So these differences, now what happened was that the Pope was still insisting to be a leader, and he was still a leader, and he was still influential in the Western side with some political powers. But in the Eastern side, the emperor was still in existence, and so in charge of the Eastern Empire. So he insisted, just like before the collapse of the Roman Empire, the emperors still insisted they had their role to play in the church. Remember, Christianity had become a state religion in AD 380 with the decree that was done by Theodosius I. So in the Eastern side, the emperor still continued insisting he was in charge of the church. And these differences went on and on. Now, so how did the split actually happen? The split took place in 1054 AD. Now, what happened was that these two leaders met in Istanbul to try to reconcile their differences again. Now, in the Western side, the one who was in charge of the Pope was called Leo IX. Whilst in the Eastern side, there was Patriarch Michael I Cellularius. He was in charge of the eastern part of the church. So Pope Leo IX represented the church in the west, and Patriarch Michael I represented the church in the east. These men met, they tried to reconcile their differences, but it looked like they just made the already bad situation worse. And in that meeting, the two men actually fired each other. The Pope excommunicated the Patriarch, and the Patriarch excommunicated the Pope. Now, of course, this was unofficial at this point. It was just verbal. But later on, Pope Leo IX sent Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida to Constantinople with a papal bull containing condemnations of the Eastern practices and doctrines. So basically the papal bull was more like a decree or an official communique which the Pope used to issue. Kings would issue decrees, but the Pope would use the papal bull. The term bull actually comes from a Latin word called bulla, meaning a round seal or a leaden seal. So having received the papal bull, Patriarch Michael I also issued his own decree excommunicating the Pope from the church, and he issued a decree condemning Latin practices, which included the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, the insertion of the Filioque clause into the Nicene Creed, and many others. And at that point, Christianity was divided forever. Now, the differences that many people know of are those differences that actually took place in the Catholic Church. At this Great Schism of 1054, the Eastern Church called itself the Orthodox Catholic Church, whilst the Western Church retained the word Catholic, which was used for the early church and which meant a universal church. Of course, later on with the Reformation and the rise of Protestantism, the Catholic Church added Roman Catholic Church to be able to distinguish itself from the Protestants. On the other side, the Orthodox Catholic Church, which meant the real church, went on and just called itself the Eastern Orthodox Church as it exists today. So I hope this has been helpful, and the question of who are the two popes or the two men that divided Christianity forever is clear to you now. This has been Dr. K, a channel on which we answer theological questions, no matter how difficult, uncomfortable, or controversial the question might be. Or because on Tell Me Dr. K, no question is off limit. And as we go, let me just remind you to subscribe to the channel if you have not, to like, comment, and share this video so that more people can be able to get this information and get educated and informed, so that together we can fight misinformation, heresy, and blatant lies that are going on in the world, especially on social media. This has been Dr. K. Bye-bye.